What if the cruelest thing Rome ever did to a queen was not to kill her, but to make her live long enough to watch her crown turned into a trophy? In the summer glare of a North African dawn, Queen Aderant of Cyrene stood on the limestone steps of her palace and listened to a city breathe in fear. The sea wind carried the smell of salt and smoke. Below, in the streets, shutters were barred. Mothers whispered. Priests burned incense to gods who, that morning, felt very far away. On the horizon, beyond the low hills and the silver band of olive groves, a haze of dust rose like a second sunrise. Rome was coming. Aderant had ruled for 7 years. She was young when the diadem first touched her brow, and the weight of it had felt like a promise. Cyrene, jewel of the Pentapolis, had prospered under her hand. The markets had swelled with saffron, glassware, and honey. Scholars debated in colonnades. Caravans from the desert brought ivory and gold. Her people called her the Listening Queen because she walked the port at dusk and spoke with fishermen and sailors as easily as she did with envoys. But Rome did not care for listening queens. Rome cared for tribute, for order, for the story it told itself about the world. And in that story, queens who stood in the way were not merely defeated, they were displayed. Her chief steward Malchus climbed the steps 2 at a time, breathless, dust on his sandals. "They've made camp at the old aqueduct," he said. "Legionaries as far as I could see, standards with the eagle, auxiliaries from Gaul, engines." Aderant nodded once. She had expected this. For months, she had delayed Rome's demands. A doubling of grain shipments, a garrison within her walls, the right to appoint a Roman advisor to sit at her side. Each refusal had been polite. Each letter, sealed with her signet, had bought time. Time had run out. "Send word to the council," she said. "We meet in the Hall of Lions." She did not rush. Queens did not run from fate. They walked toward it with their shoulders straight. As she crossed the palace courtyard, she passed the fountain where, as a child, she had floated petals and watched them circle the basin. Today, the water trembled from distant impacts Rome's engineers testing their machines. In the Hall of Lions, the council gathered. Elders in white robes, generals with scarred hands, merchants who smelled of spice and ink. Their faces were tight, eyes flicking toward the doors as if expecting the walls to crack open. "Rome offers terms," Malchus said. "Surrender the city, open the gates, hand over the treasury." And he hesitated. "Say it," Aderant said. "They demand you." A murmur rippled like wind in reeds. Aderant lifted her chin. "Alive?" "Yes, my queen." She understood at once. Death on the battlefield would have been simple. A clean end, a story told in a few lines of history. Rome did not want her dead. Rome wanted her visible, because a living queen could be used to prove that Rome was greater than any crown, used to teach other rulers what happened when they forgot their place, used as a symbol in a spectacle that would echo for generations. She felt, for a fleeting moment, the urge to order her guard to prepare a blade for her own throat. Many had done so. There were stories Carthaginian nobles, Iberian chiefs, even a Gallic queen who drank poison rather than wear Roman chains. But Aderant had always listened. She listened now to the memory of her people's voices, to the market sellers who trusted her to bargain on their behalf, to the children who ran after her horse, laughing. If she died, Cyrene would still fall. But if she lived, perhaps she could bargain one more time, not for herself, but for them. "I will go to them," she said quietly. The council erupted. Protests, pleas, curses for Rome. She raised a hand and silence fell. "Open the gates at noon. We will meet them outside the walls. No blood in the streets. No fire in our homes." "And you, my queen?" asked the general Hanno. "What will they do to you?" Aderant did not answer, because she already knew. The Roman commander waited beneath a canopy of dyed leather. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and a face carved by weather and war. His name was Gaze Varro, and his armor shone like a second sun. He studied Aderant as she approached, flanked by 2 unarmed guards. She wore her diadem, not as ornament, but as declaration. Her robes were the deep blue of the sea, threaded with silver. "You are Queen Aderant," Varro said in careful Greek. "I am," she replied. He did not bow. "Rome accepts your surrender. Your city will be spared. Your people will not be enslaved. Your temples will stand. In exchange, you will come with us." She met his gaze. "To Rome, yes. For what purpose?" Varro's mouth tightened, as if he tasted something bitter. "To walk," she understood. Of course she did. The Roman triumph. She had heard of it from traders and travelers. A parade through the streets of Rome for a victorious general. Spoils of war displayed like festival decorations. Gold, statues, captured weapons. And at the end of the procession, kings, princes, and queens in chains, forced to march while the crowd roared. A living lesson in humiliation. "Then let us not waste the day," she said. Varro studied her for a long moment. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "You will be treated according to your rank," he said. Aderant almost laughed. Rank meant nothing when one was a trophy, but she nodded. Roman soldiers stepped forward with iron shackles. They hesitated before touching her wrists, as if unsure whether to treat her like a prisoner or a relic. She extended her hands. The iron closed with a dull click. Behind her, the gates of Cyrene creaked open. Her people watched in silence. No one wept, no one shouted. They stood like statues carved from grief. Aderant turned once, meeting their eyes. She did not allow her chin to dip. She would not give Rome the pleasure of seeing her break before the journey even began. As the legion formed ranks and began the march, she felt the first true weight of what was happening. Not the iron on her wrists, not the dust in her throat, but the knowledge that her story was no longer hers. It now belonged to Rome, and Rome would make it mean whatever it wanted. They marched west along the coast for days, before turning inland toward the port where ships waited. The sun burned, the nights were cold. Roman discipline ruled every hour. Aderant was given water, bread, olives. She was not beaten. She was not insulted. She was preserved, like a rare animal destined for display. At night, she lay on a rough blanket and stared at the stars. The same stars that shone over Cyrene. The same stars that would shine over Rome. She wondered how many queens before her had watched those lights and realized, too late, that survival could be a more terrible sentence than death. On the 5th evening, as the sea breeze carried the scent of tar and salt, Varro approached her campfire. "Why did you not fight?" he asked. She looked at him. "Because you would have killed thousands to reach me." "And you think this is mercy?" "No," she said. "I think this is strategy." He considered that. "Rome does not forget those who defy it," he said. "Nor does Rome forget those it humiliates," she replied. For the first time, Varro had no answer. In the distance, the ships creaked against their moorings. Tomorrow, she would sail toward the heart of the empire that had decided her fate. She closed her eyes, queen of Cyrene, prisoner of Rome, and soon something else entirely. A symbol, a warning, a living story that Rome would tell in the loudest way it knew how. And the worst part was only just beginning. The sea didn't care that a queen stood in chains on the deck of a Roman ship. It rose and fell with the same patient rhythm it had kept for thousands of years, indifferent to empires and crowns. Salt spray crusted Aderant's hair. The ropes groaned. Sailors shouted in Latin as gulls circled overhead, hoping for scraps. She stood near the stern, iron at her wrists, watched by 2 legionaries who pretended not to stare. The coastline of Africa faded into a blue haze behind them. Ahead lay Italy. Varro, her captor, had arranged for her to remain above deck during the day. This wasn't kindness. It was because Rome valued what she was becoming, a spectacle in preparation. Her skin must not bruise. Her face must not hollow from hunger. The queen must arrive in Rome looking like a queen. The crowd needed to recognize what they were seeing, to understand the magnitude of the victory. Adoret understood this with chilling clarity. She was being preserved like an offering. At night, they locked her in a small cabin, no larger than a storage closet. The air smelled of pitch and damp wood. She slept little. The creak of the hull and the slap of waves against the sides sounded like a slow, ominous heartbeat. On the third night at sea, a storm rose without warning. Lightning tore the sky into white fragments. The deck pitched. Men shouted. Adoret was dragged from her cabin and lashed to a post so she would not be thrown overboard. Rain hammered her face. Wind howled like a beast. For a moment, just a moment, she felt something close to hope. If the sea swallowed them all, Rome would lose its trophy. But the ship held. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, gray world and exhausted sailors. Varro stood dripping near the helm, staring at the horizon with the expression of a man who had wrestled a god and survived. He glanced at Adoret. "Even the sea won't claim you," he said. She met his gaze. "Perhaps it knows Rome needs me more." They reached Ostia under a sky the color of tarnished silver. Adoret had never seen so many ships in one place. Masts crowded the harbor like a forest of spears. Cranes groaned as cargo was lifted from their holds. The air reeked of fish, smoke, and a teeming mass of humanity. Word of her arrival had traveled faster than the wind. By the time she was led down the gangplank, a crowd had already formed. Dockworkers, merchants, children, women with baskets on their hips. They whispered and pointed. "Regina," someone murmured. "Queen." She realized something unsettling. These people did not hate her. They were curious, fascinated, as if she were an exotic animal brought from a far land. Rome had taught its people to see captured rulers not as enemies to be despised, but as living proof of Rome's greatness. She was tangible evidence of victory. Varro ordered a carriage. Again, not for comfort, but for preservation. They would not risk her collapsing from exhaustion before the triumph. The road from Ostia to Rome was paved in stone so smooth it felt unnatural. It cut through the countryside with the arrogance of a ruler drawing a straight line across a map. Villages lined the way. People stopped their work to watch the procession pass. News ran ahead of them like a messenger. The African queen is coming. Children ran beside the carriage until soldiers pushed them back. An old woman spat at the ground and muttered something Adoret could not understand. A boy threw a flower into the road. It was crushed beneath a wheel. Everything here felt enormous, organized, confident in its own permanence. By the time the first hills of Rome rose in the distance, Adoret felt a strange sensation creeping into her chest. Not fear, not yet, a realization. Her kingdom, Cyrene, had been a jewel, but Rome was a mountain. The city swallowed her. Stone buildings towered above the streets, stacked and layered like cliffs. Columns, statues, arches carved with battles and gods. The noise was relentless. Carts rattling, vendors shouting, animals braying, thousands upon thousands of voices blending into a single deafening roar. She had thought Cyrene was alive. Rome was alive in a different way. It throbbed with power. She was taken not to a dungeon, but to a guarded villa near the Tiber River. Its courtyard held a fountain, citrus trees, and marble benches. Slaves moved quietly through shaded corridors. This was not a prison. This was a waiting room. A Roman official arrived that evening. He was thin, meticulous, dressed in spotless white. He introduced himself as Lucius Marcellus, a magistrate overseeing preparations for the triumph. He bowed slightly not to her, but to the idea of what she represented. "Your Majesty," he said in careful Greek. "Rome wishes you to be comfortable." "I doubt that," she replied, her voice flat. He smiled faintly. "Comfortable enough to be impressive." She said nothing. Marcellus began explaining what would happen. The triumph was scheduled in 12 days. The General Varro would ride in a chariot through the city. Behind him would come the spoils: gold, art, captured weapons. And then, you, Marcellus said gently. "In chains," she stated. It was not a question. "Yes, in ceremonial chains. They are being crafted now. Ceremonial. As if humiliation could be made elegant. You will walk from the Campus Martis to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill," he continued. "The people will see you." "They must see you. And then?" she asked, her voice steady. Marcellus hesitated. Adoret felt the truth before he spoke it. "Tradition," he said carefully, "dictates that certain captives do not leave the hill." Her stomach tightened. She knew the stories. After the parade, high-ranking captives were often executed in a small chamber near the temple, quietly, efficiently, as the crowd celebrated outside. Rome did not let symbols live for too long. She exhaled slowly. "So this is the path. Parade first, death after." Marcellus inclined his head. "Yes." Adoret surprised herself by feeling a wave of relief. An end, at least, was certain. But Marcellus wasn't finished. "There is," he added, his voice low, "another possibility." She looked at him, her gaze sharp. "The Senate sometimes chooses to keep certain individuals alive." "Why?" she asked. "For display, for negotiation, for instruction." The word hung in the air like smoke. Instruction. She understood. Some queens were not killed. Some were kept. Not as rulers, not as citizens, but as living reminders of what happened to those who opposed Rome. Her throat felt dry. "Which am I to be?" she asked. Marcellus studied her face as if evaluating a sculpture. "That," he said, "has not yet been decided." That night, sleep did not come. She walked the courtyard under a pale moon, the ceremonial chains whispering softly at her wrists. The fountain trickled. Somewhere beyond the villa walls, Rome laughed, sang, argued, lived. She realized with sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that death on the Capitoline Hill might be a mercy, because the alternative was so much worse. To live in Rome, stripped of her crown, displayed when convenient, spoken of only as a former queen. A curiosity, a lesson. Not allowed to die, not allowed to rule, simply allowed to exist as a warning. Adoret sat on the cold marble bench and stared at her reflection in the fountain's dark water. For the first time, she did not see a queen. She saw a woman caught in the machinery of an empire that understood something terrifying, that the destruction of a ruler's dignity could echo longer and far more cruelly than their death. And Rome was very, very good at echoes. At dawn, Rome began to dress itself for celebration. Garlands were hung from balconies. Incense burned at street corners. Vendors shouted over one another, selling honey cakes and watered wine to crowds that had been gathering since the night before. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Senators took their seats in shaded platforms draped with purple cloth. The city had the fever of a festival. And at the heart of it, unseen behind the guarded walls of the villa, Queen Adoret was being prepared like an object for display. 2 Roman women entered her chamber carrying folded fabric, the color of deep saffron. They did not speak much Greek, but their hands were gentle. They washed her hair with perfumed oil. They brushed it until it fell in dark waves down her back. They dressed her not in rags, but in a fine robe stitched with gold thread. Adoret understood the cruelty in this. She must look like a queen, so the crowd would know exactly what Rome had taken. When they finished, a soldier entered carrying something wrapped in linen. He unrolled it carefully on the table. Chains, but not the rough iron shackles she had worn since Cyrene. These were polished, bright, almost beautiful. each link engraved with tiny laurel leaves. They gleamed in the morning light, ceremonial chains. Adoret stared at them with a strange detachment. Rome had turned captivity into art. Varro himself came to escort her. He wore a crimson cloak now, the mark of a triumphant general. Laurel leaves crowned his gray hair. His armor shone brighter than ever. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. "It begins," he said. "Yes," she replied. He nodded toward the chains. "I did not design this." "No," she said quietly. Rome did. The soldiers fastened the polished links around her wrists. They were heavier than they looked, cold. When they led her outside, the noise hit her like a physical force. Rome was already roaring. The procession began at the Campus Martis. Trumpets blared, drums pounded. The crowd surged like a living sea, held back only by lines of soldiers. Adoret was placed in position behind wagons piled with treasure taken from Cyrene. Carved ivory, gold bowls, silk banners, statues of gods that had once stood in her temples. She felt a stab of pain sharper than the chains. They had not only taken her, they had taken her world. Varro mounted his chariot to thunderous applause. White horses stamped and snorted. He raised a hand, and the noise grew even louder. Then the procession moved. Step by step, Adoret walked into the heart of Rome. People screamed, laughed, pointed. Some hurled insults she did not understand. Others simply stared, eyes wide with fascination. "Look, the queen, from Africa." Rome conquered her. She kept her gaze forward. Dignity was the last territory Rome could not physically take from her. She guarded it fiercely. They passed beneath arches carved with old victories. Past temples and forums where statues of past heroes watched from stone pedestals. Everywhere, faces leaned from windows and rooftops. She realized something terrible. Most of these people did not see her as a person. They saw a story Rome had taught them, that no crown could stand against the eagle. The chains clinked softly with each step. The sound was delicate, almost musical, a horrible contrast to what they meant. As they climbed toward the forum, the streets narrowed and the noise intensified. The air smelled of sweat, wine, and burning incense. Petals rained down from balconies, sticking to her hair and shoulders. Flowers for a prisoner. She almost laughed at the absurdity. At one point, the procession slowed near a platform where senators sat in white robes. Their faces were calm, appraising. They were not excited like the crowd. They were evaluating. Adoret felt their eyes on her like hands. This, she understood, was where her fate might be decided, not by the roar of the people, but by the quiet calculations of men who saw power as a game played across decades. She lifted her chin slightly higher. If they wanted to keep her alive as a warning, she would give them something else to consider. A warning can also be a reminder that Rome feared what she represented. The climb to the Capitoline Hill felt endless. Her legs trembled, but she did not stumble. A temple of Jupiter loomed above, white and immense against the blue sky. Tradition said this was where it ended. The crowd could not follow past a certain point. Soldiers held them back as the procession thinned. The noise faded behind her, replaced by a strange, heavy silence. Adoret's heart beat louder than the drums had. She knew what waited inside. A small chamber, a rope, a quick end. Varro stepped down from his chariot and walked beside her now, not as conqueror, but as escort. "You have walked well," he said quietly. "Was that part of Rome's plan?" she asked. He did not answer. They reached the steps of the temple. Marcellus stood there with several officials. In his hands was a scroll sealed with wax. Adoret felt time slow. This was the moment. Death, or something worse. Marcellus broke the seal and read silently. His eyes flicked up to her, then to Varro. A long pause. Finally, he spoke. "By decree of the Senate of Rome, Queen Aderant of Cyrene is to be spared. The words hung in the air, unreal. Aderant did not feel relief. She felt cold. Spared, Marcellus continued. To live under the authority of Rome is a permanent reminder of Roman supremacy over foreign crowns. There it was. Not mercy, purpose. She was not to die. She was to remain. A living monument to Rome's power. Varro exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath. Aderant looked at the temple doors, then back at Marcellus. "And where," she asked, "does Rome plan to place its monument?" Marcellus met her gaze without discomfort. "In Rome," he said, "where all can see." Aderant understood with a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. But her role in Rome's story had only just begun. They did not take Aderant to a dungeon. That would have been too simple, too hidden. Instead, Rome placed her in a house along the Via Sacra, the sacred way, the very road where she had walked in chains before the roaring crowd. The windows opened toward the street. The balcony overlooked the constant flow of citizens, merchants, priests, and soldiers. She realized the design immediately. She was meant to be seen, not always, not dramatically, but regularly, casually, as one might glimpse a statue in a public square, a reminder woven into daily life. The house was elegant, marble floors, painted walls, servants who bowed and never met her eyes, guards at every door. She could walk the inner courtyard. She could read from the small library of Greek scrolls provided for her. She could eat well, bathe in warm water, sleep on soft linens. She was comfortable and completely unfree. Within days, word spread across Rome. The African queen lived on the sacred way. People began to pass more slowly beneath her windows. Some craned their necks to catch a glimpse. Others pointed. A few removed their hats in strange, half-respectful gestures. Children whispered and giggled. She understood the cruelty of this better than anything that had come before. In the triumph, humiliation had been loud and overwhelming. This was quiet, endless, daily. She was no longer a spectacle. She was a habit. Marcellus visited often. He explained the rules of her existence with polite precision. She would not be paraded again. She would not be allowed to leave Rome. She would not correspond with Cyrene. Her title would no longer be officially recognized by the Senate. But in conversation, people would still call her queen, because that word was useful. "You see," Marcellus said one afternoon as they sat beside the courtyard fountain, "your presence here prevents other rulers from making unwise decisions." "Because they fear becoming me," Aderant said. "Yes. And you think this is clever?" Marcellus folded his hands. "Rome prefers lessons that do not fade." Aderant looked at the sky above the courtyard, a narrow slice of blue between high walls. "You are afraid of dead queens," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Dead queens become martyrs," she continued. "Songs, legends, but living queens? Living queens become warnings." Marcellus did not deny it. Seasons began to turn. Summer heat gave way to autumn winds. Leaves from the small courtyard trees drifted into the fountain and spun slowly in the water. Aderant measured time not by dates, but by the changing sounds from the street. Harvest carts rumbling past, winter silence, spring festivals with flutes and laughter. She began to notice something unsettling. People were getting used to her. The first weeks, crowds had gathered daily. Now, only occasional onlookers paused. She had become part of Rome's background, like a monument whose story everyone already knew. And that, she realized, was another layer of Rome's cruelty. When humiliation becomes ordinary, it sinks deeper. One afternoon, a group of schoolboys stood beneath her balcony as their teacher gestured upward. "That," he said in Latin, which she had begun to understand, "is what happens when a ruler defies Rome." The boys stared up at her with wide, serious eyes. Aderant held their gaze calmly. she refused to look ashamed. If she must be a lesson, she would choose what kind. Varro visited only once after the triumph. He came without armor, dressed like a civilian, older somehow than she remembered. They sat across from one another in the courtyard. "I asked to see you," he said. "Why?" she asked. He hesitated. "Because I wanted to know if Rome had broken you." She studied him. "Has it?" Varro looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. "No." "Then Rome miscalculated," she said. He almost smiled. "You know," he said, "many expected you to beg for death on the hill." "I considered it," she admitted, "but I realized something." "What?" "If I died, Rome would win the story completely. Alive, I am inconvenient." Varro nodded slowly. "You are." Before he left, he said quietly, "There are senators who regret this decision." "Because I suffer?" she asked. "No," he said, "because you endure." Years passed. Aderic's hair grew longer. Fine lines appeared at the corners of her eyes. Rome changed around her, new statues erected, old ones removed, generals rising and falling from favor. But she remained, the queen who lived on the sacred way. Visitors from distant provinces sometimes requested to see her. Foreign envoys were subtly guided past her house. She would be invited to stand on the balcony at certain hours, not ordered, but strongly encouraged. She understood. Her life was now choreography. One evening, as the sun painted the street gold, she realized the true depth of Rome's intention. They had not only taken her freedom, they had taken her future. No husband, no children, no kingdom, no legacy except the one Rome assigned to her. She would grow old in this house while Cyrene faded into memory, while her name became attached to a single phrase in Roman speech. Remember the Queen of Cyrene, not for who she was, but for what Rome did to her. She gripped the balcony railing until her knuckles whitened. This endless, quiet erasure was worse than death, and Rome knew it. By the time Aderic's hair had turned the color of winter ash, Rome had forgotten why it had first been so proud to keep her alive. She was still there, of course, still in the house on the sacred way, still walking the courtyard at dawn, still appearing from time to time at the balcony when officials gently suggested it would be appropriate. But something subtle had changed. The people no longer looked at her with the same expression. At first, they had stared with fascination, then with indifference. Now, many looked with something else entirely, pity. And Rome had never intended for pity to be part of the lesson. It began with whispers. A baker's wife telling her daughter, she was a queen once. A veteran soldier pausing beneath her balcony and saying quietly to a friend, she has lived here longer than some emperors ruled. A young poet composing lines about the woman Rome could not kill. Stories, small at first, began to drift through the city like smoke. Aderic did nothing to encourage them. She simply continued to exist with the same calm dignity she had shown on the day of the triumph. And that, without Rome realizing it, was undoing the purpose of her captivity. Because a warning is only effective when it inspires fear. Aderic no longer inspired fear. She inspired thought. One afternoon, a girl of perhaps 10 years old slipped past the distracted guards at the doorway and ran into the courtyard. The guards rushed after her, but Aderic raised a hand. Let her be. The child stared up at her wide-eyed. Are you really a queen? The girl asked in careful Greek. I was, Aderic said. What did you do wrong? The question struck like a stone. Aderic knelt slowly so they were eye level. I did not do what Rome wanted, she said. The girl frowned. That doesn't sound wrong. The guards gently led the child away, apologizing profusely. But the words lingered in the air long after she had gone. That doesn't sound wrong. Aderic realized then that the story Rome had crafted around her was fraying. Children were no longer seeing her as proof of Rome's greatness. They were beginning to see her as proof of Rome's cruelty. Marcellus, now older and heavier, visited her one final time. He did not sit. He paced the courtyard with nervous energy. "You have become problematic," he said. Adoret smiled faintly. "I have not left this house in 20 years. That is precisely the problem," he replied. He explained that senators had noticed a shift in public sentiment. Philosophers had begun referencing her in debates about power and mercy. A playwright had even staged a thinly veiled drama about a captive queen that drew uncomfortable parallels. "Rome meant you to be a lesson in obedience," Marcellus said. "You are becoming a lesson in endurance." Adoret tilted her head. "Is that not still a lesson?" "Not the one we intended." For the first time since she had arrived in Rome, Adoret felt something like quiet triumph. Not loud, not visible, but real. She had outlasted the story Rome tried to force onto her. That winter was colder than most. Frost clung to the courtyard tiles each morning. Adoret's steps grew slower, her breath shorter. She spent more time sitting by the fountain, watching the water tremble in the cold air. She knew her body was preparing for something Rome had denied her for decades. An ending. One evening, as the sky darkened to deep violet, she asked the guards for parchment and ink. They hesitated, then agreed. There was no rule against it. She wrote in Greek, slowly, carefully. Not a plea, not a complaint, a record. She wrote about Cyrene, about the markets, the sea wind, the fountain where she had played as a child. She wrote about the day Rome arrived, about the triumph, about the house on the sacred way. But most of all, she wrote about what it felt like to be kept alive as a symbol. She did not know who would read it, but she wanted the story to exist in her own words, not Rome's. When she finished, she folded the pages and handed them to the youngest guard. "Keep this," she said. "Read it when you are older." He nodded, confused but respectful. Adoret died quietly in her sleep before spring arrived. No parade, no announcement, no spectacle. Just a still body beneath linen sheets as morning light crept into the courtyard. Rome did not know what to do. They had never planned for this moment. She had not died in chains on the Capitoline Hill, where tradition understood the meaning. She had not died as a queen. She had not died as a prisoner in a cell. She had died as something Rome had never intended to create, a memory that belonged to the people, not the Senate. They buried her without ceremony outside the city walls. But the stories did not leave with her. The baker's wife told her daughter. The veteran told his friends. The former guard kept the pages she had written, and years later shared them with a scholar. And slowly, quietly, the tale spread, not as Rome's warning, but as Adoret's. A story about how an empire tried to turn a queen into a symbol of humiliation, and accidentally turned her into a symbol of dignity that could not be erased. Rome had believed that killing queens made martyrs, so they chose something they thought was worse than death. They chose to make her live. But in the end, it was not the chains, the parade, or the captivity that people remembered. It was how she carried herself through all of it. And that was the one thing Rome had never learned how to control.